Welcome to Ouch. Was that a ghost? This podcast may contain graphic material, which some listeners may find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised.
Help me.
Now that we covered that, here's your host, Liz.
Welcome back to Ouch, Was That a Ghost? Continuing on my journey, trying to get through all of the requests, I'm covering a request by the amazing Timberly, which I had never heard of this case before, but it's one of the world's worst serial killers I'd ever heard of as I looked into it. This is a story of Belle Gunness, or Hell's Belle, or the Black Widow. She was a notorious serial killer operating in the late 19th and early 20th century in Illinois and in Indiana. She was thought to have murdered both of her spouses and all of her children with a total of over 40 victims, all for money. This is going to be funny, me trying to pronounce this. She was born Brynhild Falstader Sorseth, in Selbu, Norway, on November 11th, 1859, to parents Paul and Berit Sorseth. She was the youngest of 8 children. The family wasn't a rich family by any means. They really struggled financially, and Belle did not like growing up poor. There's a story that may or may not be true that was said to be a pivotal moment in her life. When she was around 18, she became pregnant. It's said that somebody forced themselves upon her, and while she was at a dance one day, forced themselves upon her, and this is the cause of her impregnation. She was at a dance, and this rich D-bag kicked her in the stomach, causing her to lose the baby. And I've seen speculation that this was in fact the father of the child, and because the guy was rich, nothing ever happened to him. But he did end up dying not too long after. I think it said stomach cancer, but some say that this may have been her first murder. People say that after this event, something snapped in her. Her whole demeanor changed. She had enough of growing up poor. Like, she wanted to take control of her own life. She got a job. She worked as a servant on a wealthy farm, and she saved up money until she had enough to come to the U.S., as her sister had a few years prior. She did end up making enough money for the trip to the United States in 1881, and while she was being processed by immigration at Castle Clinton was like Ellis Island before Ellis Island was a thing, and she changed her name from Brynhild to Belle, a more American-sounding name. I mean, can you blame her? Belle made her way to Chicago to join her sister, Orlena, who changed her name to Nellie. While she was staying with her sister and her brother-in-law, Belle worked as a maid, and then she got a job at a butcher shop cutting up animal carcasses, which was not as hard as you might think for her, as she had been raised on a farm, and she already worked on a farm, and her stature helped. She was said to be about 5'9", 5'10", and weighing over 200 pounds. She was described as tall and strong. The way they describe her, I'm picturing the sister on Encanto. In 1884, Belle met and married Mad Sorensen in Chicago. And this part of the story varies a lot. Some people say that she had a few children with him and adopted some, but a lot of articles claim that neighbors claim to never have seen her be pregnant. So I don't know if she actually adopted all the children or bought some children. That wasn't unheard of back then. Either way, they had some children. And 2 years after marrying, they opened a confectionery shop, a candy store. As fun as that sounds to run, oh my gosh, imagine that, being just like surrounded by gummy worms, gummy bears, gummy everything. I'd be in my glory. But as amazing as that sounds, the store was not very lucrative. They were actually losing money. And around a year after opening, the store burned down. And the couple collected an insurance payout for the property, which they used to buy a new house. But their good fortune didn't last very long, as 2 of their adopted infants, Caroline and Axel, both died in Belle's care, both under 6 months old, by the way, from acute colitis, which is the inflammation of the large intestines. Symptoms of that could be nausea, fever, diarrhea, stomach cramps, which can also be symptoms of poisoning. Both children had insurance policies, so when the children died, she collected that payout as well. I don't know why that seems like such an alien concept to me to have life insurance policies on children that are that young. That should have maybe been a red flag, unless maybe that's normal to some people. It's just very strange to me. Then their new house had a fire. Like, wow, what bad luck. It burnt down, so they collected a payout from that, and then they got a bigger and better house. Man, the bad luck that follows her, huh? A few years later, a heart attack took Belle's husband, Mads Sorensen, who happened to have 2 life insurance policies at the time because he had an old one that was about to expire tomorrow and a new one that was starting. So the day he died on July 30th, 1900, both policies were active at the same time, overlapping, and he happened to die on that day. Strange, huh? The first doctor that saw the body thought that this was a case of strychnine poisoning. But after he talked to the family doctor, who said that Mads had been treated for an enlarged heart in the past, the original doctor was like, oh, okay, so it's just heart failure. Belle explained how he had come home with a headache and she had provided him with quinine powder. I'm probably saying that wrong. I looked it up too. Sorry. For the pain. And she later checked in on him and he was dead. Soon after Sorensen's sudden death, his family started pushing the authorities to look further into this. They suspected that he had been poisoned for the insurance payout because, what are the odds that he dies on that day? But nothing ever came of it. No charges were ever filed, and no autopsy was ever performed because the doctors did not consider it suspicious. Belle collected the money from both the expiring life insurance policy and the one that went into effect that day, making it a total of $8,500, which was a lot of money at that time. Between the fire insurance money, the life insurance payouts from the suspicious deaths, Belle purchased a pig farm in LaPorte, Indiana, and weirdly, 2 buildings on the farm burned down. Isn't that crazy? She was getting ready for her move to the farm, alongside her 3 children that remained, when she reconnected with Peter Gunness, who recently lost his wife. The 2 recently widowed hit it off. He was also from Norway, and he had 2 children, and she had kids. And he was a butcher, and I guess they had that to talk about, the butcher line of work. The 2 lovebirds, Belle and Peter Gunness, were married in LaPorte on April 1st, 1902. The bliss did not last very long, as the very next week, while Peter was out of the house, Peter's infant daughter died in Belle's care of unknown causes. 8 months later, in December 1902, Peter also met an early death. Belle's version of events were that Peter was reaching for something on a high shelf and a meat grinder fell off of a high shelf in the kitchen onto him, smashing his skull, attributing his death to a skull injury. But the coroner took one look at this and he was quoted saying, "This is a case of murder." If you're still on the fence on what happened, one of Belle's children, adopted children, Jenny, told a friend at school that Belle hit Peter over the head with a meat cleaver. But Belle somehow was so convincing in her story to the authorities, nothing ever came of the case. The next year, thankfully, Peter's brother Gust, I love that name, took Peter's oldest daughter, Swanhild, to live with him in Wisconsin, avoiding whatever fate awaited her if she stayed with Belle. And I think that she was the only child to survive Belle, unless I missed one. I'm pretty sure that's the only child that survived her. But either way, Belle got no charges pressed against her, and she ended up collecting the insurance money, $3,000 for Peter's death, which, again, that's huge money back then. That's equivalent to over $80,000 today. The people that lived in her town weren't really buying her story because Peter, having ran a farm for years, he dealt with dangerous equipment pretty regularly. And he was a butcher. Again, dealing with all these things on shelves, which he could get down without dropping them on his head. It just seemed very suspicious. The district coroner even looked into the case and determined this was a murder case. But Belle must have been pretty charming because the investigators were like, okay, you didn't do it. There was a whole inquest and everything, but nothing came of it. Belle was pregnant during the inquest, actually, and in May 1903, she gave birth to a son, Philip, which may have been her first child. If all the other ones were adopted, I'm not really sure. I see a lot of conflicting things on that, but I know that this is one that she actually gave birth to. In late 1906, Belle told her neighbors that she sent Jenny off to a boarding school in California. If you remember, Jenny was the one that told her friends that her mother hit her stepfather over the head with a cleaver. And Jenny was never heard from again. So now she has a farm, no husband, an infant, and a few kids. So she needed help. In 1907, she hired a man named Ray Lampier to help her on the farm. But that wasn't all he was doing. Once Ray got a few drinks in him, he would tell anybody that would listen how he was hooking up with his boss. Belle wanted more than just hookups with Ray. She wanted more money. In 1905, Gunness began placing advertisements in local newspapers for wealthy male suitors. They were called marriage ads in the Lovelorn column. And of course, I'm going to read you one of her ads. Quote, "Comely widow who owns a large farm in one of the finest districts in LaPorte, Indiana, desires to make the acquaintance of a gentleman equally well provided, with view of joining fortune. No replies by letter considered unless sender is willing to follow answer with a personal visit. Triflers need not apply." End quote. These were placed in newspapers throughout Chicago and surrounding states, promising a life of love and prosperity. I guess an old-timey Tinder. Within no time, several middle-aged men of means replied. The men would come with cash to court Belle. On Sundays, Belle and the suitors would be seen going for carriage rides. There she would transform from the usual farm-ready attire in overalls into her finest gowns, her hair all done up. As quickly as the men appeared, they would just disappear, and their families would never hear from them again. One of her gentleman callers was a John Moe from Minnesota. He told the neighbors that he was there to pay off her mortgage, and she was like, "Oh, him? He's my cousin." And within a week, he was never seen again. George Anderson came from Missouri, and he was, as far as I know, the only surviving courter or answerer, the only surviving male that answered her ad. He traveled from Missouri. They had dinner together where Belle would say how she was behind on her mortgage, and he was like, "Oh, sure, I'll marry you and pay it off." And then they both seemingly retired for the night in separate bedrooms. And in the middle of the night, George woke up and saw this figure standing over him, only illuminated by candlelight. And you know, when you first wake up, you have to blink a few times to kind of focus. And when he could focus, he made out Belle's face, but it wasn't how it was earlier in the evening. Her face was contorted and just filled with rage. He said later that her appearance was so sinister that he let out a scream. Belle, seeing that George was awake, ran from the room without saying a word, and George made a life-saving decision to leave right then and there. He threw on some clothes and ran for the train, just getting out of Dodge. And he never even bothered to send for his stuff. And I mean, what is he going to do? Go to the police and be like, "Oh, this woman was standing over me"? So, I mean, nothing came of that. But men kept answering the ad. There was Ole B. Budsberg. I love these names. Ole B. Budsberg, a widower from Wisconsin, who was her next caller. He was last seen alive on April 6, 1907, at LaPorte Savings Bank, where he took out thousands of dollars. He mortgaged a property and transferred a deed while he was there. His kids later reached out to Belle, and she was like, "Who, me? I never saw the guy." A Wisconsin farmhand named Henry Gorhalt saw the ad, and he traveled to LaPorte to meet Belle. And once there, he wrote to his family saying how much he liked the farm and how he was in good health. And he just requested that they sent him seed potatoes. I don't know if they actually sent the seed potatoes or not. That's one part of the story that is a mystery. The family didn't receive any more mail from Gerhalt, which was out of character for him. So they ended up reaching out to Belle, who said, "Oh, he left. He went off to Chicago with some horse traders." She ended up keeping his trunk and his fur overcoat, which that doesn't seem suspicious. I hope you sense my sarcasm. In 1907 or 1908, Andrew Hegeline of South Dakota answered Belle's ad. And he showed up like all the others did, but there was a problem. If you remember, Belle had a little friends with benefits situation going on with Ray Lampier. he had caught feelings for her, so he was now in love with her, and he was starting to get jealous. When Belle ended up introducing Andrew Hegeline to Ray Lampier as her fiancé, Ray made this huge scene. She ended up firing Ray, and within a few days, her fiancé was gone. And right after her fiancé was gone, Belle had to swing by the bank to deposit $1,200. Like so many others, Andrew Helgeline was never seen again. His brother Astley ended up reaching out, being like, "Hey, where's my brother?" And unlike the other family members of the missing men, Astley didn't believe the tale of where Andrew went. He did a little digging, and the last time his brother was seen alive was at LaPorte Bank, depositing a check for $2,900. And this just didn't sit right with Astley. Meanwhile, Ray Lampier, her farmhand, who had developed feelings for Belle, who was just fired, went to the bar and got drunk. And he started opening up to others about things he'd seen and heard. And Belle, probably scared of what Ray might say, went to the courts and started saying, "Oh, Ray's out of his mind." And the courts, again, she must have been super convincing. But the courts agreed to a sanity hearing for Ray. He was found sane and released. And then shortly after, Belle came back to the court and told how Ray came by her house and he was a threat to poor Belle and her children. I don't know if he actually went there or not, but whatever. And she managed to get him arrested for trespassing. After his release, he would still try and see Belle. And one neighbor reported that Ray was leaving one day, and he told the neighbor, quote, "Hegeline won't bother me anymore. We fixed him for keeps." Meanwhile, Hegeline's brother is still trying to figure out what happened to his brother, writing letters back and forth with Belle. And Belle was like, "Nope, he didn't come here. Maybe he went to Norway." And his brother was like, "Yeah, I don't think so." And Belle was like, "Fine, if you want to come and look, that's fine. But if you want me to help in any way whatsoever, you have to pay me." Can't say Belle was a bad businesswoman. Belle ended up going to a lawyer in town and having a will drawn up that everything be left to her children if anything were to happen to her, because she was afraid of what Ray Lampier would do, not to the police, to a lawyer. Now Belle is back in her old predicament. She has a big farm, children. She needed help, so she hired a man named Joe Maxon. After only a few months, in April 1908, Joe Maxon awoke to the house fully ablaze. He tried to call for Belle and the children, but no answer. He did manage to jump out of the window and survive, and he ran out to get help. But the Gunness farmhouse was burnt to the ground. In the smoldering ruins, workers found 4 skeletons in the basement, thought to be the bodies of Belle's 3 children, 11-year-old Myrtle, 9-year-old Lucy, and 5-year-old Philip. There were also remains of a headless adult woman, initially thought to be Belle Gunness. The sheriff, Albert Smutzer, knew of the history of Belle and Ray Lampier, so he had Ray arrested immediately and had his men try and find the corpse's missing head. Ray claimed he had nothing to do with the fire, but there were witnesses that said that they saw Ray running down the road by the farm. It should be noted that friends and neighbors that saw the headless corpse were like, "No, that's not Belle." Which that's also bizarre to me, like that everyone could just trample the crime scene. That's so funny back then. Well, not funny, but just, I don't know, just a strange concept. But as the neighbors and friends were over there, they said, "Yeah, this corpse is probably a little bit over 5 feet tall and maybe 125 pounds, as Belle was closer to 200 plus pounds and almost 6 feet tall." The doctor who performed the postmortem on the headless body also testified that the body was about 5 inches shorter and about 50 pounds lighter than Gunness. There was some bridge work found, like dental work, so a local dentist came in and looked at it and was like, "Yeah, that's dental work I did for Belle." So the coroner listed the corpse as Belle's, which, okay, you have no head, but you have some dental work, so that's enough. The head was never found. So some people believe that the corpse was Belle, but some say it was definitely not. Astley Helgeline made his trip from South Dakota to the farm. If you remember, he was the one that was looking for his brother. And he told the sheriff how his brother answered the ad that Belle had placed. And he told the sheriff how his brother brought his life savings to the farm with him, and he had not heard from him since. And he ended up staying on the farm as the rubble was being searched. and he started searching the property as well on his own. The new farmhand, Joe Maxson, that Belle hired after Ray, kind of alluded to the sheriff about some weird stuff that happened over by the pig pen area, just finding it strange that Belle had ordered him to bring wheelbarrows full of dirt by the pig pen, and how there were a lot of holes over there that were covered up. There were supposed to be trash holes, and others in the area claimed to have seen Belle dig over there at night. The sheriff, hearing this, took a group of men over there to the pig pen area to dig. And once they started digging, they found Jenny Olson's body, who Belle, if you remember, said she sent off to boarding school, and 2 other children they could not identify, where watches were being found, teeth were being found. And they started finding other bodies there too, 4 that were sliced and wrapped in oilcloths, and one happened to be Ashley Helgeline's brother Andrew. As the days passed, more and more bodies were discovered. But because of how the bodies were disposed of, not all could be identified. And the calls and communication that the law enforcement was getting from all these people that had family members that answered the ads, there's a lot of assumption here onto who the bodies are, but not all of them could be identified. A further investigation unearthed the partial remains of at least 11 additional people. As the days went on, more bodies were found in shallow graves throughout the property. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention was Astley brought with him a letter from Gunness to his brother, and that's how he found out that that's where his brother went. And it was dated January 30th, 1908. In Belle's handwriting, the letter read, quote, "To the dearest friend in the world. No woman in the world is happier than I am. I know that you are now to come to me and be my own. I can tell from your letters that you are the man I want. It does not take one long to tell when to like a person. And you I like better than anyone in the world. I know. Think how we will enjoy each other's company. You the sweetest man in the whole world. We will be alone with each other. Can you conceive of anything nicer? I think of you constantly. When I hear your name mentioned, and this is when one of the dear children speaks of you, or I hear myself humming it with words of an old love song. It is beautiful music to my ears. My heart beats in wild rapture for you, my Andrew. I love you. Come prepared to stay forever." Like, how ominous is that, knowing now what you know? Knowing that the man would only be left as 2 hands, 2 feet, and 1 head in a bag, which was how he was found. And his poor brother having to identify that. A head, 2 hands, and 2 feet. That's all that's left of him. That's so terrible. Subsequent inspection of the site revealed that there were dozens of holes in the yard. As they kept digging, they found burlap sack after burlap sack filled with body parts. They found 5 bodies on the first day, 6 on the second, and they just stopped counting. With all of this, obviously the perception of Belle Gunness swayed. She was no longer looked at as a poor woman that died in her house, trying to save her children. The unassuming mother now seen as responsible for the death of many and most not being able to be identified. They did manage to get 14 bodies completed, which that sounds so terrible to say, with many parts of unidentified victims remaining. Some say as many as 40 victims were buried there or disposed of there. On May 22nd, 1908, Ray Lampier, who was Gunness's higher hand and on and off again lover, was tried for murder and arson. At the time of his arrest, he actually had some of the deceased men's things, like shoes and watches, on his body, which he claimed that Belle just gifted to him, and he pled innocent. In November 1908, Lampier was convicted of arson in connection with the fire at the Gunness house, but not murder. He was sentenced to 21 years, and a little over a year later, Ray died from complications with tuberculosis. A few weeks after Ray's passing, a reverend came forward that said that Ray Lampier had confided in him leading up to his death, like a deathbed confession. Lampier had confessed to him that Gunness had in fact placed advertisements seeking male companionship only to murder and rob the men, but that he himself never killed anybody. But he was guilty of helping her get rid of the bodies. He described how when a male suitor would come, Belle would be charming. She would make him a nice meal, and then after she would make some coffee, and she would lace the coffee. Once the male suitor was disoriented, she would, quote, split his head with a meat chopper, end quote. Or she would wait for him to sleep and use chloroform. Once she was sure that they were dead, Ray claimed that she would bring the body to the basement, chop it up into bundles, and bring them out to the pig pen area and bury them. or she would put them into a hog scalding vat, and if she was too tired, she would just feed the body parts to the pigs. Lampier stated that Gunness asked him to burn down the farmhouse with her children inside, and he also asserted that the body thought to be Belle's was in fact a female that Belle brought back from Chicago. She enticed this female back to the farm with the promise of a housekeeping job. And Ray described how Belle hit the woman over the head and then removed her head and weighed down her head and threw it into the swamp. And then Belle dressed the corpse in her own clothing, and Belle left her own dentures for identification, the young woman being planted to mislead investigators. He described how Belle used chloroform on her own children as well, and then smothered them to death before bringing them down to the basement. And the reason she did all this was because the brother of one of her victims, Astley, had warned Gunness that he might arrive at the farm shortly to investigate his brother's disappearance. And this is what caused her to burn down her house, fake her own death, and take off. Belle was supposed to actually meet up with Ray after the house was on fire at like some crossroads or something. But he said she never showed up and that she ran off into the woods and left him standing there. Ray told of how rich Belle had become with this scam. He claimed that it was over 42 men that she had killed, each man bringing not just money, their life savings. Ray estimated that she had made over $250,000, which is well over $7 million today. Her bank accounts were checked, and there was almost nothing left. She had withdrawn nearly all of her money right before the fire. Although the coroner listed Belle Gunness as the deceased corpse, if it really was her and she died in the fire that day or escaped still remains uncertain. For decades, alleged sightings were reported all over the U.S., long after she was declared dead. Police followed up on a lot of these leads, but none were determined to be Belle. In 1931, a woman named Esther Carlson was arrested in Los Angeles, charged with poisoning a man for his money. Sound familiar? She ended up dying while she was waiting for her trial, but some say the resemblance between the two women was uncanny. And she happened to have a picture of children which strongly resembled Belle's children. I mean, I see the similarity, but I can see how, I don't know. I might post the picture so you guys can tell me what you think. In 2008, with Belle's family's permission, what some believe to be Belle's corpse was exhumed from her burial site next to her husband, her first husband, Mad Sorensen. Forensic anthropologists were trying to get answers. Like, is this really Belle? So they performed DNA tests on the headless corpse in an attempt to compare the DNA from the corpse against a sample from a letter Gunness had sent to one of her victims, hoping that the sealed letter would have enough DNA, but it wasn't enough. Due to its age, the sample was not viable, so it couldn't be properly tested. The Gunness farm turned into a tourist attraction. People traveled from all over the world to see mass graves. They sold snacks, sold souvenirs. And actually at the LaPorte Museum, they actually have a permanent Belle Gunness exhibit. Belle has been the inspiration for many books and movies. So what do you think? Do you think it was Belle in the fire, or do you think she got away? And do you think that those were her children in the basement? Or do you think that she snuck off with her children and just, I mean, obviously she had no problem killing children. Like, how sick is that? I can't even wrap my head around how people think. But I would love to hear your thoughts. Well, thank you everybody for listening. And thank you again, Timberly, for your wonderful suggestion. I can't believe I never heard of this story before. Such a horrific woman. Child killers are like next level, but your own children? I don't know. It's something I can't wrap my head around. Well, thank you everybody so much for listening. Bye.
Thank you for listening. If you need more content or just want to help support the podcast, head on over to patreon.com and search Ouch, Was That a Ghost? If you need some snazzy merch, you can find it at crowdmade.com by searching Ouch, Was That a Ghost? If you have a story you'd like to share, you can email it to ouchwasthataghost@yahoo.com. You can also find us on Facebook and all the other social media platforms under Ouch, Was That a Ghost?
Help me.
All links can also be found on ouchwasthataghost.com.